Anxious and apprehensive, Maria Weston Chapman made her way to the podium in a newly built Pennsylvania hall. The seemingly simple task of lifting her leg and planting it in front of the other became increasingly laborious as the weight of 3,000 audience members turned their attention towards her. As she neared the podium, where William Lloyd Garrison was eagerly waiting to give her the stage, she heard the violent shouts of anti-abolitionists rioting outside the hall. This was her first time giving a public speech. Chapman grasped the podium and tried to brush away the tension engulfing her. 3,000 sets of eyes glared at her mouth, expecting words to pour out and soothe their need for a sweet speech so eloquent it strengthened their desire for the immediate abolition of slavery. Chapman opened her mouth, and the rioters outside grew louder. The 3,000 pairs of eyes winced as some of the rioters began to throw rocks through the windows. They looked at each other, at Chapman, and at Garrison, and then back to the door leading them outside. Chapman urged them to stay, for as worried as they all were in the face of such violence, it was not new to her. She gave her speech, and she spoke of abolition, of freedom for every American citizen. On May 17, 1838, Maria Weston Chapman gave her first and her last public speech. After the meeting concluded that foreboding night in 1838, the anti-abolitionist rioters unleashed their rage on the 4-day-old Pennsylvania Hall and burned it to the ground. When Chapman received this news, she suffered an emotional collapse which hospitalized her. Upon returning to her role as an immediate abolitionist, Chapman never took the podium again. However, she maintained a highly visible and even controversial image in public. Indeed, her career battling the evils of slavery had always been quite visible and left her very exposed. Maria Weston was born in 1806 to an upper-class family in Weymouth, Massachusetts. As a young teen, she moved to England with her paternal uncle, where she was formally educated. In her free time, Weston engaged in conversations with political thinkers who opened her mind to world affairs and encouraged her to think critically. It is these years that she spent discussing with English political thinkers and questioning her environment that she credits her later activism for the abolishment of slavery. In 1828, Maria Weston moved to Boston and began work as a principal of a newly founded high school for girls. Shortly after moving back to America, she met Henry Grafton Chapman, a wealthy abolitionist who she would marry 2 years later. Once she married Henry, Maria Weston Chapman quit her job as principal and became a full-time activist, wholly immersing herself in countless projects to raise money and awareness about abolition. She plunged headfirst into controversy by partnering with William Lloyd Garrison, an immediate abolitionist. During the abolition movement, the most popular goal was gradual abolition, which sought to abolish slavery by a number of indirect means, such as shipping slaves to Africa or purchasing their freedom. To both Chapman and Garrison, the idea of waiting for abolition was inherently sinful and only promoted more man-stealing. Because there was no room for any sort of compromise with slaveholders in their plans for freedom, they both were considered radicals of their time. Chapman worked on numerous projects organizing groups, creating journals, writing, editing, and raising money and awareness for abolition. She worked with Garrison on his newsletter, The Liberator. Chapman wrote essays about the need for immediate abolition, edited essays that were posted in The Liberator, and helped raise money to keep the newsletter from collapsing into debt. Her work raising money is perhaps her most innovative work, as she created multiple venues to get abolitionists together. Chapman started bazaars, which were like festivals for abolitionists to gather, discuss, and sell various items to raise money and awareness about the evils of slavery. In 1832, Chapman co-founded the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society to complement Garrison's all-male New England Anti-Slavery Society. Her group was met with much violence and even protest. During their annual meeting in 1835, Anti-abolitionist rioters surrounded the building, shouting and throwing objects at the windows. When the mayor came to the meeting, begging them to leave the building to ensure the woman's safety, Chapman responded resolutely, "If this is the last bulwark of freedom, we may as well die here as anywhere." Physical violence was a constant threat to Chapman and abolitionists of her time. So the riots she experienced at the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society meeting and at the Pennsylvania Hall were not new to her. In fact, she expected aggression. Before another meeting with the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, Chapman was quoted in a conversation with Harriet Martineau for saying, "You know we are threatened with a mob again today, but I do not myself apprehend it." Indeed, violence was a common part of being an immediate abolitionist. So why did Chapman refuse to give a public speech after Pennsylvania Hall was burned down? What incited the emotional breakdown? It seems highly unlikely that it was the physical violence that discouraged Chapman from engaging in public forums. Perhaps that night proved to her that her voice was strongest in her writing. Perhaps she felt in her element with pen and paper, writing some of the most controversial tracts that even sparked verbal aggression within her own abolitionist community. As a member of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, Chapman worked as secretary, taking notes on the meetings and writing public tracts for abolitionists around America to read. These public tracts were narratives of anti-slavery organizations in the Boston area, which detailed their ideologies and their work. Her most famous piece of writing is one of these tracts she published in 1836 entitled "Right and Wrong in Boston." In this tract, she chastised the Unitarian Church for supporting gradual abolition, which she believed only perpetuated slavery's firm grip on all aspects of American society. She also spoke against the Unitarian Church for preventing women from taking on a powerful and public role in working towards abolition. Like other contemporary first-wave feminists, such as Maria Stewart and Lydia Maria Child, Chapman believed that her activism had everything to do with her faith and little to do with her gender. When she wrote "Right and Wrong in Boston," Chapman was met with much negativity, not only from the Unitarian Church, but from within her own organization, the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. They even attempted to persuade her to change the tract so that it was more socially palatable. She was accused of harsh language and even atheism for utilizing her right to freedom of speech, ensuring a public voice for herself, and questioning authoritative figures. However, her religious loyalty never faltered despite the accusations of the Unitarian Church. Her Christian faith is clearly expressed in her writings, such as the Songs of the Free and Hymns of Christian Freedom, which she published in 1836. After the controversy of her Right and Wrong in Boston, she resigned as secretary from the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society and worked even harder on creating her own journals, such as Non-Resistant and Liberty Bell, which published abolitionist essays and poetry. The divide within the abolitionist community between immediate and gradual abolitionists deeply concerned Chapman. To her, it was clear that gradual abolition only perpetuated slavery. She makes this clear in her essay, "How Can I Help to Abolish Slavery?" and even her public tract, "Right and Wrong in Boston." Most of her work involved persuading people to seriously consider immediate action and unify into a single movement which fought for liberation. When she wasn't writing essays about abolition, she was making connections among abolitionists around the world, ranging from Boston, Massachusetts to London, England. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and slaves were given legal freedom, Chapman retired her work as an activist. She spent her free time traveling throughout the United States and England, writing and taking care of her family. In 1885, Maria Weston Chapman died in the same town she was born in, Weymouth, Massachusetts. One has to consider the kinds of stresses Chapman was enduring when she had that one traumatic emotional breakdown on May 17, 1838, after her speech in Pennsylvania Hall. Coupled with the multiple responsibilities she had as an immediate abolitionist, she was caring for her 6 children and her husband who had contracted tuberculosis. In her letters to women in her nuclear and extended family, she wrote about the insecurities she felt about being a full-time activist and a mother. She often mentioned how her work kept her from taking proper care of her children. And it is surprising that despite all her concerns and her work, she never once seemed to show any worry about herself. Once she left the hospital in 1838, Chapman continued all her hard work as an entrepreneur and community organizer. Her work had everlasting effects in the Boston area and in the history of abolition. Garrison said to her once in a letter, "Your position and influence have been preeminently valuable." And he was right. It is impossible to measure how much her perseverance, determination, and unyielding need to achieve immediate abolition affected the movement, as Chapman created and supported organizations which continue to inspire activists who are still fighting for freedom today.